Okay. I'm gonna ask you just straight up. You didn't have anything to do with this, did you?
I don't like that type of crap.
You don't like the type of crap where people get gunned down?
The couple was found shot to death on the porch of their Willard home.
Did you know what she did?
No, I didn't.
Don't hold back now.
You're not good at lying.
This is a lot like a football game. We're the Chiefs. You're on a junior high team right now. You need to pick which team you're going to be on. Because if you don't do what's right, it's going to get brutal for you.
When I arrived, there was 2 people on the front porch and blood everywhere. Both victims looked as though they had been shot and were obviously deceased. The reporting party told me that they had a daughter, so I wanted to check for more victims inside the house. She was found in the bathroom of the home, uninjured. Alex had several gunshot wounds to the head. Brianna had 2 gunshot wounds. Alex had an empty holster on his right side and a Glock handgun laying between them near his right hand.
There was an idea that he might have expected that there was going to be a problem, that he was going to have to defend himself.
It was fully loaded, so we knew it wasn't a murder weapon. But I noticed a large amount of 9mm shell casings in and around the victims' bodies.
There was a police officer who lived near the crime scene who realized that he had a doorbell camera. When that was reviewed, it did find the gunshots of the attack at 1:21 a.m.
I heard what sounded to be 10 gunshots in a cadence of 5. A small break, and then 5 more gunshots. None of them overlapped. This led me to believe that there was a single shooter. Someone else has surveillance cameras near their driveway. We were able to see a small economy-style vehicle around the same time as the murders. We weren't able to see the license plate or the color of the vehicle because it was at night, but that was a big piece of evidence.
So the reason we're here is the police received a report this morning which concerns Alexander's house. Okay.
Okay.
But they did find Alexander and Brianna deceased. I don't have a lot of details right now. So just take a second to process that. That's a lot of information.
She didn't say anything. She didn't ask about her daughter. She didn't ask any questions about the crime. Sometimes the sound of silence speaks louder than 1,000 words. Do you know anything about any of that?
No.
I was working all night.
And you, just to be clear, what was your shift last night?
My shift was 6 p.m. till 1:30-ish. I usually stay and hang out for a little bit before I leave. When I got home, I was exhausted.
Right.
Didn't take long before I fell asleep.
When was the last time you had any contact with Alex? Phone, text?
Sunday, October 18th was the last time I spoke to him, according to my phone.
And then have you had any contact with Brianna?
I've never even met her.
Okay.
She didn't seem shocked. She didn't seem worried or concerned. It was suspicious.
Alex and Teresa were not on good terms. There were associated claims regarding mistreatment of their daughter that each was making against the other.
Get some light going on. There we go. Good. Okay, have a seat. See your agreement there.
Yep. Let me show you the part. There is that part. Every Sunday at 8 a.m. he's supposed to bring her to me. I texted him and said, I'm here where we normally do the exchange. And he said CPS is ordering him not to give the child over. Yeah. I plan on also having him prosecuted for violating a court order as well. I don't know what he's trying to accomplish with this.
All right, follow me.
Okay.
Teresa Cox had reported a 9mm handgun stolen from her vehicle. This really stuck out to me, as the shell casings at the crime scene were 9mm shell casings.
And then there was a subpoena that was served on Teresa's phone number. Text messages were discovered between her and Mixie that appeared to be planning the homicide. Mixie was talking about needing to get her head in the right space for what's going to happen tomorrow, which was sent on Thursday when the homicide occurred overnight on Friday. Also, it had previous messages between her and Mixie. Mixie is confronting Teresa and saying, "You want me to kill someone?" Teresa seems like the mastermind. I think she realized Mixie was willing to do things for her and was able to manipulate Mixie into pulling the trigger and killing Alex and Brianna.
When I think of Alex, the first word that comes to my mind is funny. His spirit was lighthearted, friendly. He was always ready with a kind word.
In his youthful days, he was a little bit geeky. As he grew bigger, he became physically active and then followed eventually in my footsteps and joined the Army. No matter how big he got, he was still my little boy.
Brianna was like a sister to me. She was pretty feisty. She was just gonna take on the world and no one was gonna tell her no. She worked 3 jobs just to be able to afford the house that she bought. She was so caring. And she loved children. She talked about Alex's daughter as if she were her own.
Alex and Brianna met at a pizza parlor. He said it was instant love. Alex just talked about his future with Bree and having other children. He was so happy.
You probably heard about what happened up in Willard.
I've heard a little bit. That's pretty much it.
So do you work with Teresa? Is that what it is?
Yeah, I was her
okay.
manager.
So what happened Friday night then? Well, you guys were working together?
Yeah, she was there until, what was it, 1:30?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, 1:30, and then went home.
What time did you guys close that night?
I didn't get out of there until 4 o'clock.
Did her girlfriend show up that day or that night anytime?
Not that I remember.
Okay. Was there anything different about Teresa that Friday night?
No. She was upset because she couldn't see her kid.
Matt told me that Tree was with him until they all left at 4:10, and the girlfriend got there about like 2.
Interesting.
So Matt said to the police that Teresa went home after work, and Matt told you Teresa hung out with him all night, and he took her home.
I don't know why he would have said opposite things, but Tree was there just as late as he was. Her girlfriend didn't get there until a little earlier before they left.
Okay, so you're 100% sure that Matt took Teresa and her girlfriend home?
Yeah.
It was obvious that someone was lying. It did not seem like Ariel was in any way involved in this, but we believed that Matthew Plum could be hiding something.
Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
Not too bad.
Thanks for coming in, bro.
Not a problem.
I'm Shannon Shipley. I was the one that called you on the phone.
Yeah.
I appreciate you coming in. Okay. So, I'm gonna ask you just straight up. Matt, you didn't have anything to do with this, did you?
My daughter Katie, I heard her crying in the living room pretty uncontrollably, and I heard her move closer to my bedroom, just screaming, crying. She's like, "Mom, sit down, sit down. It's Alex." And she goes, "He's dead." You could have just knocked me over with a feather. It was the worst day of my life.
You might know that I talked to Ariel
Yeah.
on Saturday. Some of the things that she told me, you told her, versus what you told the other officers didn't quite match. Did she tell you that?
A little
Quite
bit.
the same?
A little bit.
Okay, and so Friday, what happened?
Friday night, Teresa, her car was breaking down. She come in and told me that she had to let it sit because the transmission was overheating or getting hot or something. I didn't really
Did you ever
understand.
listen to somebody say their transmission's hot? Ever in your life, somebody said, "My transmission's really hot"?
It kind of.
Okay, no is the
It
answer.
kind
Let's
of
just be
seemed
real.
funny to me that I just let it go and
Okay.
went on with my job. What I'm taking is she just didn't want to drive no more because she wasn't getting very good tips or whatever. She just wanted to work inside.
What happened?
She was doing my dough prep, helping me clean up. Every once in a while she'd make a couple pizzas. And then around 12:30, 1 o'clock, we got one last delivery, and my closing driver took that one.
And Teresa's with you?
Until like 1:15, and then she left.
Each time he would tell even a small lie, he would kind of wave his lie off by giving me the hand signal, "I just lied to you." Whenever he gave me that signal, I knew to keep following that trail.
So there were no visitors that night, correct?
Not that I remember. There was one time her girlfriend came up there, but I didn't see her after that.
That's a visitor.
That was like around 5 o'clock that afternoon.
So between 2 and 4:10 when you checked out, nobody came by?
Okay.
Not that I remember, because like I said, I was busy doing everything.
Sure.
What happened then?
My nephew had my truck,
Mm-hmm.
and I called him to come pick me up when I was able to get off work. My nephew took me home. Apparently, Tree and her girlfriend was at my house. I got there and they were there.
They just showed up at your house in the middle of the night.
They had walked over or something, I don't know.
But she lives 30 minutes away, so how would she show up on foot? That doesn't make sense.
I
Right.
didn't ask.
Don't hold back anymore, because I can see you
And
are.
that's what I'm not.
I can
I'm just-
see you are. You're not. You may think so, but you're not good at lying.
He really wants to keep lying, and I keep cutting him off. I want him to know I only want to hear the truth. And as I keep pursuing that, it pushes him into a corner to make a decision. Is it time to tell the truth? Am I going to be able to get out of this?
So I took them home, so I could go to bed.
You forgot that you took them home?
I was
That's
I
a
was
big
sleepy.
thing to forget.
I was sleepy, tired. I was so tired anyway, I didn't even remember.
And so how was Teresa and her girlfriend acting?
Actually, just like they normally was. I mean, she was upset about her car, but that's it.
Yesterday, you and I had a conversation on your porch. Remember what I told you when we were standing there? What did I tell you?
To be completely honest with you.
You like football?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So this is a lot like a football game. And what we're doing, we're the Chiefs. Teresa and Mixie are on a junior high team right now. You need to pick which team you're going to be on, because it's going to get brutal for you. If you don't do what's right.
I'm not choosing their team.
You had conversations with them that you're not telling us.
Not them, no.
That's not true. That's not true.
Regular people, when you tell them that they're lying, will get very upset. Nobody wants to be called a liar. It doesn't bother him one bit because he knows it's true.
If there's something you think you're going to be in trouble for, you need to be the first one to talk about it. Because the first person that talks gets the best deal. Whatever's in your mind right now, you need to tell us.
Mixie showed up at work right around 2 o'clock, just after Tree left. She was a little bit nervous about something. She was distraught. I told her to sit down, and I'll see if I can find Tree.
How do you know she was looking for Teresa?
Because I put 2 and 2 together on that.
What did Mixie tell you?
She was saying something about she did something horrible.
Did you already know? Did you know what she did?
No, I didn't.
You put 2 and 2 together?
I didn't know. I'm hoping she didn't. I don't like that type of crap.
You don't like the type of crap where people get gunned down?
No, I don't.
Yeah, I don't like that either.
I think there's a lot more to this conversation than you're letting us know still.
She didn't really tell me anything.
Is it because you already knew what she did, she didn't have to tell you?
You knew it was going to happen?
That was a yes. That was a
Yep,
yes.
it was. Okay, so you already knew.
Okay, you already knew. Got it.
You're worried you're going to be in trouble because you knew it was going to happen. You didn't do anything. You tell this lady exactly what happened and don't hold back now. This is it.
The head goes down, and we know that he's getting ready to give us some significant information, but he's having a hard time saying it.
Can I have a cigarette first?
Yes, absolutely. Not in here. You've got to go outside.
The cigarette break, it's a calculated risk. Could it be a chance for a person to decide that they don't want to do this anymore? Yes, but sometimes leaving the interview room is also a stress reducer.
About 2 weeks ago, before this happened.
Okay.
Asking me I knew where she could get a throwaway gun.
You're talking about Teresa?
Yeah.
Okay.
I told her no, I don't.
Sure.
So about a day later, she tells me that she has a gun. She was upset about everything going on.
Right.
And then she started talking to me about wanting to do it on a certain day. I'm like, well, if you're actually going to do it, do it. But I don't really want involved. If you're going to be at work, hey, there's your alibi.
Right.
I'm same one on shift.
Sure.
So I was going with the alibi.
So why did Mixie come back to the store?
Because that was the plan.
That was the plan?
I guess for her to borrow Tree's car.
Okay.
Go do it, come back to the store, and then pick Tree up, come up, get the car, and go home.
What did they do with the gun?
That I do not know.
Teresa was looking for a way that she could carry out the homicides and avoid any consequences. You can see that in the setting up the alibi with Matt Plum. She manipulates all the pieces. She didn't care who, even among her friends, got hurt carrying out what she wanted to do.
Okay.
So the plan, was that something that you and Teresa discussed?
Teresa discussed with me the plan.
And was Mixie any part of that plan that you heard or you saw? Or was it just you and Teresa?
Just me and Tree.
Okay. So was part of the plan then for Mixie to do the terrible thing? Okay.
So Teresa clocked in at what time?
I think it was 6 when Tree come in and told me her car was messing up.
Yeah.
Her car wasn't messing up.
Yeah.
Right. We know that.
She was doing deliveries. And at like a certain point. Then she backed off.
And she stopped because
Mixie took her car.
Mixie didn't come back with the car
And
until
so,
like 1:30.
1:30, Tree went out, got in it. Mixie come in. That's when I was trying to calm her down, keep her out of the way. I asked her what it was, but
And she told you because you knew the plan.
I couldn't understand what she was saying because she was so hysterical and stuff.
But she did calm down.
She calmed down a little bit. She told me that she killed him.
She killed him? Or?
I guess she killed both of them.
And Mixie didn't tell you how they got on the porch?
I didn't ask. I didn't even want to know because it was already too much for me.
Did they ask you?
No. I told them no.
Now that you're, telling the truth and being honest, omission is a form of deceit too. So if you've not told us stuff that we're going to find out, that would be bad.
The GPS is going to show that I went driving around before I went home, just to clear my mind.
Where'd you go?
I went to Rutledge Ridge walkways, and I sat out there for a while.
What'd you do?
I just sat in the truck.
What were you thinking about?
Why I even agreed to it.
There's something more. Go ahead and hit me with it.
Think of something. What is it?
I told Teresa if you wanted to get rid of a gun, Rutledge Wilson was a good place to go. That's why I drove down there, to make sure she wasn't down there.
Rutledge Wilson Farm Park is a working farm that is a park in Springfield. It's heavily covered with trees and foliage, a good place to dump a murder weapon.
If you got rid of the gun, tell us now.
I didn't get rid of it.
Okay, well, here's the thing. If Mixie and Teresa say anything like, hey, look, I gave him the gun to get rid of, that's going to be bad. Dude, if you took that gun, I get it. I understand that. Other people will understand that, but what they won't understand is if you went all this way and then didn't come clean 100%. If you got rid of the gun, please don't hold back if you did that.
Yeah, I did.
Okay. So, Mixie, did she give you the gun when she came in? Or what?
I don't know how it ended up in my truck.
You just saw it in your truck?
Yeah, I found it.
Where was it?
It was sitting underneath my back passenger seat.
Okay. And you know where it's at now?
I'll show you exactly where it's at.
Is it outside?
It's in the water.
It's in the water. Okay. Well, we can go for a ride. You can show us where you pitched it. Would that be okay? You were going to be in some trouble, okay? But dude, I'm telling you right now, honesty helps you.
What kind of trouble am I looking at?
It depends. You're being helpful now.
We got in the car and Matt took us to the location where he had thrown both the gun and the magazine. As soon as we were at the location, the Missouri State Highway Patrol dive team was able to locate the gun.
The firearm matched the serial number that Teresa Cox had reported as stolen.
Finding the gun was big. It was a direct tie of the murder weapon back to Teresa Cox. The evidence showed that he aided Teresa with the intent to further the homicide. She was able to manipulate Matt Plum into disposing of the murder weapon. Teresa, frankly, is the mastermind. It doesn't happen without her. We learned there was a friend who had helped him buy hair dye and told the police that they were in fugitive mode. It became apparent that Teresa and Mixie were on the run.
We learned they hitched a ride with a trucker into Joplin and left the state. We were offered aid from the U.S. Marshals. They told me in no uncertain terms, we will get your guy.
We obtained a search warrant for Teresa Cox's residence. We located a portable safe in the closet. We found a Smith & Wesson handgun magazine. The casings had S&B 9x19-20, the same head stamp found at the crime scene. Also, we received information from Teresa Cox's phone.
Her internet search history was showing things like, what's the easiest way to kill people? How do you report a gun stolen? And then you also have things about how to go on the run.
She had searches for Alexander Schutz and Breonna Sproul's residence, which showed 41 photos of their house. It seemed that she had been planning the murders for quite some time.
Teresa had a 2014 red Chevy Spark, which has a very distinctive profile. When I looked at the vehicle in the video, it looked exactly like a Chevy Spark.
Our case was going from a very, very strong circumstantial evidence case to a hard evidence case.
At that point, Mixie's taken into custody, and the marshals reach out to let our office know that they also had Teresa.
Teresa didn't want to speak without her lawyer present, and so an interview with Teresa wasn't ever established. But Mixie was willing to speak with us.
Let me take those off you, okay?
We wanted to establish more evidence against Teresa, that Teresa was pressuring Mixie to do this.
A lot has gone down in a little bit of time, and everybody is scared, all right? Everybody's pointing at you, Mixie. You're going to have one opportunity to put your side of the story out there. People that you thought were your friends are not your friends. They're all scared and they're all singing like canaries, all right? They want you to take the whole heat for this, and I know that's not true. Right now, you're the only advocate for yourself.
I'm not supposed to say anything.
You're kind of at a crossroads where you have to make a decision for yourself. Do you want to protect Matt and Tree, or do you want to clarify how this thing came to birth? I already got everybody else's side of it. And I know that if it wasn't for pressure from Tree, this thing would have never happened. Would have never happened. So you tell me what you want to do.
There ain't nothing I can say.
What kind of relationship do you and Teresa have?
She's my best friend.
Any more than that?
A lot more. I mean, I loved her.
Do you still love Teresa?
Yes. That's never gonna change. And I miss Tree. Just want things to be back to normal.
I don't believe that normal's coming back. Tell me about the pressure that you were being placed under by Teresa.
I don't want to go into any of this, y'all. And I'm still confused about a lot of things.
Are you confused about how you got drug into this?
A lot of times, yeah.
How do you think you got drug into this?
I don't know.
It was going to be a battle getting Mixie to roll on Teresa because she was so in love with her. So I'm going to have to change to focus on Matthew's participation.
I don't want to waste your time. I already read the reports. Nothing about this whole thing is pleasant.
What I need is a confirmation that Matt is being truthful in what he's saying, because he's throwing everybody he can under the bus to get himself some kind of sweetheart deal right now.
I don't think anybody's going to be truthful in this situation.
You're probably right. Are you?
I have no reason to lie.
Why is that?
I just don't. I'm not a liar.
Then I guess it comes down to what part did everybody play in this?
I guess that's the part that nobody knows then. I don't want to do this conversation anymore.
Okay, that's all right. But you're screwing yourself.
As long as Tree's okay.
Tree's not going to be okay.
Let her know I love her.
Mixie was done talking that day, but didn't close the door for subsequent interviews.
Someone in here? Thank you, Detective. Yeah, have a seat right over here. Go ahead and close the door. Yep.
Are you cold?
No, I'm just shaky.
Okay.
I've been shaky.
Okay. Can I ask you what pronouns you like to go by?
She, her.
And if there's something you don't want to answer, you don't have to answer it. And you can stop at any time you want.
I guess I'll chit chat for a little bit.
All right. When did you meet Teresa, Mixie?
Early July. She just saw me sitting by myself one day, and she came up and she sat down and started talking to me, and she admitted to me that people said to kind of steer clear of me because I was weird, and she didn't really want to listen to them. She wanted to give me a chance. So
that's great.
We became pretty good friends from there.
Gotcha. Thank you. So I wanted to show her that I was professional and that she was being respected. I want her to feel at ease. After that, then I can ask direct questions.
I did choir for a little bit. I was never a very good student. Art was really my only good subject.
I think you have a story that people don't understand. I'm reading stuff on Facebook. And people are saying negative stuff about you. They're saying really rotten stuff about you. And I don't think they know the whole story, and I don't think it's fair. Mixie, did you shoot Alex and Brianna? I want to know.
No, sir.
Okay. Do you know who did?
No, sir. I don't know anything about any of that.
How did you find out that Alex had been killed?
The news.
What did it make you feel?
I didn't know what to feel. With Alex, I had asked Teresa before if I could get to know him, but I never really got the opportunity to.
Why not?
She said he wasn't trustworthy and was a bad guy, and so I was wanting to eventually sit down and get all whatever their bad blood was worked out, but it just never worked out that way.
And why was there blood between them?
She told me a lot of things. She told me he used to beat on her, and he'd tell everybody it was because he had PTSD.
You ever think to yourself, I wish Alex would just go away?
No, it was not my place to think things like that.
Did Teresa think that?
I don't know. I mean, she didn't like him.
Teresa took every opportunity to sway people, to maneuver their feelings about Alex, to cause him to be a villain in their eyes, and to favor her.
Why do you think someone would harm Alex?
I don't know.
Why would someone harm Brianna?
I have no clue why someone would hurt her.
If you had to name the real true victims in all this, who do you think the real true victims are?
I have no clue. I don't know how to answer that question. I'm sorry.
Mixie, tell me why you couldn't have done this.
Because it's just not me. It's just not a thing that I'm willing to do.
For someone that had no involvement, it's a real quick answer. I didn't do it because I wasn't in Willard, because I had no ill will against Alex, because I had no firearm. But if they did do it, they have to convince you that they weren't part of this. And at this point, Mixie waffles a little bit.
I was out getting drunk with my friends anyway.
Who were you drinking with that night?
I think I'm done with questions. I just want to go back up to myself.
Go ahead and turn around for me.
There was a recording that Brianna took on her cell phone on the night of the murder. You can hear her talking to someone. I recognize the voice to be Mixie's voice.
Hey, I'm sorry to bother you again. I just wanted to ask what time you would be back, just so that I kind of know a rough time when you can be here so I can talk to you guys, because it's important information.
I can call him if you want to do that.
I'd just rather reveal it to you guys in person.
Let me call him and see when he's going to be home.
Mixie was luring Alex back home He was originally supposed to work from 4 p.m. till midnight, but he left an hour early. He told a coworker that his girlfriend Brianna was alone and he was afraid for her, and that's why he had a handgun on him at the crime scene.
The first of 3 suspects charged with killing a Willard couple has pleaded guilty to his role in the double murder. Matthew Plump took a deal from prosecutors and pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit a felony and tampering with evidence.
I just want to begin by saying I'm sorry to the family. And I'm sorry to Alex and Brandon. I knew it was wrong, and on the way there, I was asking myself, what the hell am I doing?
Teresa Cox pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and 2 counts of armed criminal action. Cox addressed the court, but didn't show any remorse.
While she was being sentenced, she was making claims that whatever she did for the daughter.
I love her, and everything I've ever done is to give her the best life I could. Her safety, security, and happiness are my priorities in this life. As for the future, I wish to pursue her dreams and have the utmost success. Lastly, I hope she and I will have a relationship no matter where we are both at, if she so desires. Thank you.
Cox was sentenced, but not before Schute's family said their piece.
I couldn't believe that she was capable of something that much.
Suffice to say, she is the face of evil. My one wish is that she gets everything she deserves and more. Because she is a psychopath.
Teresa Cox was pure evil. She was somehow able to convince her co-workers to carry out murder, but we were able to bring some measure of justice to the family.
We get to keep a little piece of him alive through her.
That was Alex's baby girl, and he loved her so much. All Brianna wanted to do was love her like she was her own. I miss so much about Brianna. I miss everything about her.
Alex's birthday is on Veterans Day, and we gather together on that day and have a toast in Alex's name and talk about a fun memory, and we include the entire family.
I miss his wit. I miss his laughter, his gorgeous blue eyes. He was just a wonderful, thoughtful guy. He just made the world a better place.
The investigation into Linda O'Keefe's murder began with urgency, confusion, and a community desperate for answers. In the days following her disappearance and death, Newport Beach was transformed. Streets that once represented comfort and safety became reminders of fear. Parents watched their children more closely. Neighbors looked at strangers differently. A quiet coastal town suddenly found itself at the center of a horrifying question that nobody could answer. Who was capable of taking the life of a 12-year-old girl? Detectives knew the first hours of an investigation could determine everything. Every minute mattered. Every witness mattered. Every detail, no matter how small, could become the thread that unraveled the entire case. But Linda's killer had left investigators with a difficult challenge. There was no clear path, no confession, no obvious suspect, no single piece of evidence that immediately pointed to the person responsible. The crime scene was carefully examined. Investigators collected anything that could potentially reveal the identity of the killer. They documented every detail, interviewed anyone who might have seen Linda that afternoon, and attempted to reconstruct the final moments of her life. The timeline became the foundation of the investigation. Linda had left her summer school program and started walking home. She was familiar with the area. She was not wandering through an unfamiliar neighborhood. She was following a routine. That fact made the crime even more disturbing. Because whoever approached Linda likely understood that she was alone. Someone noticed her. Someone had an opportunity. Someone made a decision that would change countless lives forever. Investigators began looking into every possibility. They considered whether Linda knew her attacker. They considered whether the killer was a stranger who happened to cross paths with her. They examined the possibility that the crime was planned. Each theory created more questions. If Linda knew the person, why had nobody come forward? If the killer was a stranger, how had he managed to disappear so quickly? If the murder was planned, how long had Linda been watched? The answers remained hidden. The search for witnesses became one of the most important parts of the investigation. Detectives returned again and again to the neighborhood where Linda was last seen. They spoke with residents. They asked people to remember details from an ordinary summer afternoon that suddenly became one of the most important moments in local history. But memory is fragile. A person walking down the street, a car passing by, a stranger standing in an unusual place. At the time, those details seemed meaningless. Only after tragedy strikes do people realize that ordinary moments can become evidence. One of the most significant leads came from reports of a suspicious vehicle. A white van. The description was not perfect. There was no license plate number, no confirmed identification of the driver, but the image remained in the minds of investigators. A white van near the area where Linda disappeared. A possible connection. A possible clue. Or simply another dead end. For years, the van became part of the mystery surrounding the case. It represented everything investigators struggled with, the possibility of an answer that was always just out of reach. As detectives continued working, Linda's family faced the unimaginable reality of losing their daughter while watching the investigation slowly become more difficult. Every parent's worst nightmare had become their reality. The future they imagined for Linda disappeared in a single day. Her room remained. Her memories remained. But Linda herself was gone. The pain of unanswered questions became almost as devastating as the loss itself. They did not know who had done it. They did not know why. They did not know whether the person responsible was nearby, watching the investigation unfold, or whether he had already disappeared into another life. That uncertainty became its own form of punishment. Meanwhile, investigators continued following leads. People were questioned. Backgrounds were examined. Possible suspects were considered. But the case refused to break open. Years became decades. The world changed. Technology advanced. But Linda's case remained frozen in 1973. The original investigators eventually retired. New generations of detectives inherited the file. They opened the same folders. They looked at the same photographs. They read the same reports. And they faced the same impossible question. How do you solve a murder committed before modern forensic science existed? In the 1970s, DNA testing was not part of criminal investigations. The microscopic evidence that might one day identify a suspect was simply beyond the reach of investigators at the time. Evidence existed, but the tools needed to understand it had not yet been invented. That would become one of the most frustrating realities of Linda's case. The answer may have been there all along. Hidden inside evidence collected decades earlier. Waiting. As the years passed, Linda's murder became one of Orange County's most painful cold cases. It joined a long list of investigations that remained unresolved despite years of effort. But unlike a forgotten file sitting in an archive, Linda's name continued to live. People remembered her. The community remembered her. Her story continued to be shared because behind every piece of evidence was a real child whose life was stolen. The passage of time created another challenge. The world moved on. Potential witnesses grew older. Memories faded. People relocated. Some possible sources of information were no longer available. Every year added another layer between investigators and the truth. But there was something else time did. It created the illusion of safety for the person responsible. For more than 40 years, whoever killed Linda O'Keefe avoided accountability. He lived through decades of history. He watched technology change. He watched criminal investigations evolve. He may have believed that the distance of time had protected him, that the world had forgotten. that the case was permanently trapped in the past. But investigators never fully closed the door. Cold cases have a strange quality. They can remain silent for years, sometimes for decades. Then one discovery can change everything. A new witness, a new forensic technique, a new connection, a single piece of information that suddenly gives meaning to evidence that had been waiting untouched for generations. And that moment would eventually come for Linda O'Keefe. But before the breakthrough, there was still a long road ahead. The case would endure years of uncertainty, years of unanswered questions, years where Linda's family had to live with the knowledge that the person responsible was still unknown. The killer had escaped the headlines. He had escaped public attention. He had escaped the fear of arrest. But he had not escaped the evidence. Because buried inside the original investigation were clues that would one day return with incredible force. The world of forensic science was about to change. And when it did, Linda's name would return to the front pages. The cold case that had haunted Newport Beach for generations would suddenly become one of the most remarkable examples of justice arriving decades late. A murder from 1973. A mystery frozen for 52 years. And a killer who believed time had erased his crime. But time had not erased anything. It had only been waiting. The years after Linda O'Keefe's murder passed slowly, but the question surrounding her death never truly disappeared. For the people of Newport Beach, the case became a permanent scar. It was the kind of tragedy that changes the way a community sees itself. A place known for ocean views, quiet streets, and endless summer afternoons was forced to confront a terrifying reality that evil could exist even in the most ordinary moments. Linda had not vanished in the darkness of a deserted road. She had not disappeared in some remote location. She was taken during a normal day while simply trying to return home. That fact made the crime impossible to forget. The image of a young girl walking home became the final memory connected to a mystery that would remain unsolved for decades. As the investigation continued through the 1970s, detectives followed every lead they could find. They searched for patterns. They examined possible suspects. They reviewed statements from witnesses. They looked for any connection that could reveal who had been responsible. But the case remained silent. The evidence told a story of a crime. But it did not reveal the identity of the person who committed it. The killer remained unknown. And with every passing year, the distance between the crime and the investigation grew wider. The world of criminal investigations in the 1970s was dramatically different from today. There were no massive digital databases connecting suspects across states, no advanced DNA genealogy systems, no ability to analyze genetic material with the precision modern investigators now rely on. A case could depend entirely on eyewitness memory. And memory changes. A face becomes less clear. A detail becomes uncertain. A moment that seemed important decades earlier can slowly disappear. For Linda's family, however, there was no moving on. The world continued. Children grew up. Technology advanced. New generations were born. But Linda remained forever 12 years old. Her family continued hoping that one day someone would come forward. Maybe a witness who had been silent for years. Maybe someone who knew more than they originally admitted. Maybe a person who had carried a secret for decades and finally decided they could no longer live with it. But no confession came. No arrest came. No answer came. The investigation became a cold case. A phrase that carries a painful meaning. A cold case does not mean forgotten. It means unfinished. It means somewhere, buried beneath years of silence, there is still a truth waiting to be discovered. And Linda's case had something many investigators believed was crucial. Evidence. The original investigators had preserved what they could. Physical evidence collected in 1973 remained part of the case file. For decades, that evidence existed in a world where science had not yet learned how to fully use it. But forensic science was changing. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. The same evidence that once seemed impossible to understand was becoming more valuable with each new scientific breakthrough. DNA technology transformed criminal investigations around the world. Cases that had been considered impossible began reopening. Names that had been forgotten began appearing again. Victims who had waited decades for justice finally had their stories heard. And investigators began looking again at old cases, not because they had new suspects, but because they had new tools. Linda O'Keefe's case remained one of those mysteries waiting for a second chance. As the decades passed, different investigators touched the file. Some were detectives who had worked cold cases for years. Others were younger investigators who had not even been born when Linda was murdered. They all faced the same challenge: a crime committed in another era, a suspect who had disappeared into ordinary life, and a mountain of unanswered questions. Who was the person driving the vehicle connected to the investigation? Did the killer live in Newport Beach? Was he someone Linda knew? Was he someone who blended into the community and remained unnoticed? These questions followed the case for decades. But perhaps the most frightening possibility was this: the person responsible may have spent all those years living a normal life, going to work, building relationships, growing older, while knowing exactly what he had done. That possibility haunted investigators. Because time does not erase guilt. It only creates distance. And sometimes that distance allows people to believe they are safe. By the early 2000s, advances in DNA analysis had begun changing the future of cold cases. Evidence that once held no answers could now reveal genetic information. Investigators across the country started reopening old files, searching for biological clues that had been invisible for decades. The idea was simple but powerful. The past leaves traces. A person can change their appearance. They can move. They can change their name. They can build a completely different life. But DNA does not forget. The challenge was finding the right evidence and applying the right technology at the right moment. For Linda's case, that moment had not arrived yet. But the investigation was not dead. Behind the scenes, the case continued to exist. The file remained active. The questions remained open. And Linda's name continued to represent an unfinished promise: justice. Then came a new era of investigation. A time when detectives could use methods that investigators in 1973 could never have imagined. The rise of genetic genealogy opened a completely new chapter in criminal investigations. Instead of searching only through traditional law enforcement databases, investigators could compare unknown DNA profiles with broader genetic information to identify possible relatives. It was a revolutionary tool, and it changed the way cold cases were solved. Murder cases that had remained locked for 40 or 50 years suddenly began breaking open. Killers who believed they had escaped forever were being identified. The past was returning, and investigators began wondering, could this technology finally answer the question that had haunted Linda's case for decades? Could a crime from 1973 finally be solved? The answer depended on one thing: the evidence. If usable DNA remained from the original investigation, the possibility existed. A tiny biological trace. Something invisible. Something the killer never thought would matter. Something that could connect him to a crime committed more than half a century earlier. The case had survived through changing times. It had survived through changing investigators. It had survived through decades of disappointment. But now, for the first time in generations, there was a reason to hope. The frozen file was beginning to thaw. And somewhere inside those old records was a clue powerful enough to bring Linda O'Keefe's killer out of the shadows. The world was about to learn that a mystery could wait 52 years. But justice could wait longer. The decision to reopen a decades-old murder investigation is never made lightly. Every cold case carries the weight of faded memories, missing witnesses, and evidence that has survived the passage of time by little more than careful preservation and hope. For many investigators, Reopening a file means accepting that the odds are against them. The trail is older. The people involved have aged. Some are no longer alive. Yet every so often, a case refuses to disappear, and Linda O'Keefe's murder was one of those cases. By the time a new generation of detectives began taking another hard look at the evidence, the world of forensic science had been transformed. Methods that had sounded like science fiction in 1973 were now part of everyday criminal investigations. DNA profiling had become increasingly sophisticated, allowing laboratories to recover genetic information from evidence once believed to be unusable. More importantly, investigators were beginning to realize that solving an old murder no longer depended solely on finding a witness or obtaining a confession. Sometimes the evidence itself could speak, even after half a century. The original investigators had done something that would prove invaluable decades later. They preserved physical evidence from the crime. At the time, they could not have imagined how powerful that decision would become. They collected items because it was good investigative practice, not because they knew future technology would unlock secrets hidden within them. Years turned into decades, and those carefully stored pieces of evidence remained untouched by time, waiting for science to catch up. Cold case detectives approached the investigation with fresh eyes. They were not burdened by assumptions made in the 1970s. Instead, they reviewed every report, every photograph, every witness statement, looking for inconsistencies or overlooked opportunities. Modern investigations often begin not with dramatic breakthroughs, but with patient repetition. Reading old interviews again, comparing timelines, asking whether a detail dismissed decades earlier might suddenly carry new significance. Linda's case demanded exactly that kind of patience. Every document was reviewed. Every known witness was reconsidered. Every surviving piece of physical evidence was evaluated for modern forensic testing. The process was meticulous. There were no shortcuts. Investigators understood that if they made a mistake, they might lose the only opportunity they would ever have to identify the killer. Meanwhile, forensic scientists examined the preserved evidence using techniques unavailable in 1973. What earlier generations of investigators could not detect, modern laboratories could now isolate with remarkable precision. Tiny biological traces, invisible to the naked eye, could produce genetic profiles capable of identifying an individual with extraordinary accuracy. The possibility was both exciting and terrifying. If a usable DNA profile existed, it could finally answer the question that had haunted Orange County for generations. But if no profile could be developed, the case might remain unsolved forever. The waiting was agonizing. Laboratory work does not happen overnight. Evidence must be handled with extreme care. Every procedure is documented. Every result is verified. Scientists know that one contaminated sample or one careless mistake can compromise years of work. As investigators waited, Linda's family continued living with uncertainty. Hope had become something dangerous. They had experienced promising leads before, only to watch them disappear. Every phone call carried the possibility of life-changing news, but also the risk of another disappointment. For decades, they had learned not to expect miracles. Then, at last, the laboratory produced something investigators had been hoping for: a viable DNA profile. It was one of the most significant developments in the history of the investigation. For the first time since 1973, detectives possessed evidence capable of identifying the person responsible, not through eyewitness testimony or speculation, but through biology itself. Yet another obstacle immediately appeared. Having a DNA profile was only the beginning. The profile did not automatically reveal a name. Investigators compared it against criminal DNA databases, expecting perhaps that the killer had been arrested for another crime during the previous 50 years. No match. The databases remained silent. The man responsible for Linda's murder had either never submitted DNA through the criminal justice system or had successfully avoided creating a record that investigators could access. Once again, the investigation reached what appeared to be another dead end. Years earlier, that would likely have been the end of a story. But forensic science had continued evolving. Detectives now possessed another option: investigative genetic genealogy. The method had already transformed several high-profile cold cases by identifying suspects through distant relatives rather than direct DNA matches. Instead of searching for the killer himself, investigators searched for members of his extended family whose genetic information had been voluntarily submitted to public genealogy databases. It was painstaking work. A partial match could represent a second cousin, a third cousin, someone connected only through generations of family history. Genealogists then reconstructed enormous family trees, working backward through birth records, marriage certificates, census documents, military records, newspaper archives, and public databases. Thousands of names, hundreds of branches, decades of history. Every relationship had to be verified. Every connection had to make sense. Investigators were no longer hunting a face. They were hunting a family tree. The process required extraordinary patience. Professional genealogists spent countless hours tracing bloodlines across multiple states and generations. One incorrect assumption could send the entire investigation down the wrong path. Slowly, however, patterns began to emerge. Several genetic connections appeared to point toward the same extended family. The list of possible individuals narrowed. Investigators began examining which male relatives fit the known facts of Linda's murder. Who had been old enough in 1973? Who had lived in or traveled through Southern California? Who had access to a vehicle? Who could realistically have encountered Linda on the afternoon she disappeared? The investigation was becoming increasingly focused. Names that had never appeared in the original case file suddenly entered the conversation. Detectives quietly conducted background investigations. Employment histories, residential records, military service, driver's licenses, old addresses. Everything was examined. One particular individual gradually attracted increasing attention. His history aligned in troubling ways with the timeline investigators had spent decades reconstructing. His age fit. His movements appeared consistent. Certain details from his past raised additional questions. Still, suspicion was not enough. Cold case investigators understood that after 50 years, any accusation had to be supported by overwhelming evidence. They needed confirmation. Scientific confirmation. The DNA profile recovered from the crime scene had to be compared directly with DNA belonging to the man now emerging as their primary suspect. But obtaining that comparison required careful planning. Detectives could not simply announce their suspicions. If they were wrong, they could irreparably damage an innocent person's life. If they were right, alerting the suspect too early might jeopardize the investigation. Surveillance began. Quietly, patiently, investigators watched without revealing their interest. They waited for an opportunity to legally obtain a discarded DNA sample, something abandoned in public that could be collected without confrontation. A discarded item, something as ordinary as a drinking cup, a napkin, a piece of trash. The smallest object could determine whether 52 years of unanswered questions were finally about to end. For the first time since Linda O'Keefe left school on that warm July afternoon in 1973, investigators believed they were closer than ever to learning the truth. The frozen case file was no longer gathering dust on a shelf. It was alive again. Every laboratory result, every family tree, every surveillance report, every carefully preserved piece of evidence was converging toward one extraordinary possibility. The child whose voice had been silenced more than 5 decades earlier was finally beginning to tell investigators exactly who had taken her life. And somewhere, completely unaware that science and persistence were closing in from opposite directions, a man who had lived for decades believing the past was safely buried was about to discover that time had preserved more than memories. It had preserved the evidence that could finally expose him. Investigators knew they had reached the most delicate stage of the case. 50 years of unanswered questions had narrowed to a single possibility, but possibility alone could never justify an arrest. Every cold case detective understands the same unwritten rule: after decades of waiting, there is no room for error. One mistake could destroy the credibility of the investigation, jeopardize a future prosecution, and deny a victim's family the justice they had pursued for half a century. The man now drawing the attention of investigators had never publicly been connected to Linda O'Keefe's murder. His name had not dominated newspaper headlines in 1973. He had not stood at the center of the original investigation. If detectives were correct, he had spent decades living beyond suspicion, protected not by innocence, but by the simple limitations of forensic science during the era in which the crime occurred. Surveillance became methodical. There were no dramatic car chases, no flashing lights, no late-night confrontations. Instead, investigators watched quietly, blending into ordinary life while documenting ordinary routines. They observed where he went, when he left home, how he interacted with people, and most importantly, they waited for the opportunity every forensic investigator hopes for, a legally abandoned source of DNA. The suspect had no reason to believe anyone was watching. To him, it was another ordinary day. He drove familiar roads, stopped at familiar places, disposed of everyday trash without a second thought. What appeared insignificant to him represented the final missing piece for investigators. Every object discarded in public carries traces of the person who used it. A tissue, a coffee cup, a napkin, a drinking straw, invisible skin cells, and saliva remain long after the object has lost its value. Modern forensic science can recover extraordinary amounts of genetic information from evidence that earlier generations of investigators would never have considered useful. Eventually, detectives collected an abandoned item believed to contain the suspect's DNA. It was transported under strict chain of custody procedures. Every movement was documented, every transfer recorded. The sample entered the laboratory. Then came another period of waiting. Laboratory comparisons require precision. Scientists cannot simply announce a match because two DNA profiles appear similar. Every genetic marker must be examined. Every result must withstand intense scientific scrutiny. The standard is extraordinarily high because the consequences are enormous. Investigators understood exactly what hung in the balance. If the DNA failed to match, they would be forced to begin searching all over again. If it matched, one of California's oldest unsolved child murders would finally have a name attached to it. The laboratory completed its analysis. The DNA recovered from the decades-old evidence was compared with the newly obtained sample. The profiles matched. After more than 50 years, biology accomplished what thousands of interviews, countless investigative hours, and decades of determination had been unable to do. The evidence identified the man investigators believed had murdered 12-year-old Linda O'Keefe. The result was both extraordinary and heartbreaking. Extraordinary because science had reached across half a century to answer a question that once seemed impossible. Heartbreaking because the answer confirmed what Linda's family had feared all along. The killer had not vanished. He had simply remained unidentified. The investigative team now shifted into another critical phase. Every piece of evidence had to be reviewed again. Cold case prosecutions demand overwhelming preparation. Detectives could not rely solely on DNA. Prosecutors would need a complete narrative explaining why the evidence established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Old witness statements were revisited. Historical records were assembled. Timelines were reconstructed with modern precision. Investigators compared the suspect's known movements, residences, employment history, and available documentation against everything preserved from 1973. The case grew stronger. What had once been isolated fragments now formed a coherent picture. The suspect's history aligned with the investigation in ways that detectives could not ignore. For Linda's family, developments remained largely confidential. Law enforcement often protects the integrity of an investigation by limiting public disclosure until sufficient evidence has been assembled. Families may know progress is being made, but details remain closely guarded. Hope returned cautiously. Hope had disappointed them before. This time felt different. Behind closed doors, prosecutors evaluated whether the evidence met the legal standard necessary to file murder charges despite the extraordinary passage of time. The answer would determine whether justice could finally move from possibility to reality. The legal system recognizes no statute of limitations for murder in California. Time may complicate an investigation. It does not erase accountability. If sufficient evidence exists, a suspect can be prosecuted regardless of how many years have passed. That principle carries enormous significance for cold case investigators. Every preserved fingerprint, every biological sample, every carefully documented report represents a promise that justice remains possible. Linda O'Keefe's case had become proof of that promise. The investigation that began on a July afternoon in 1973 had survived changes in technology, generations of detectives, and decades of frustration. Now it stood on the edge of resolution. Inside law enforcement circles, preparations quietly accelerated. Arrest planning requires careful coordination, particularly when dealing with an elderly suspect whose life has settled into predictable routines. Detectives consider timing, location, officer safety, evidence preservation, and media attention. Nothing would be left to chance. The operation had to unfold with the same professionalism that had characterized every stage of the renewed investigation. Meanwhile, the suspect remained unaware. For decades, he had lived with a secret known only to himself. He had watched the world change. He had seen criminal investigations transformed by science. He had likely heard stories about old murders being solved through DNA. Perhaps he believed his own crime belonged to another era. Perhaps he believed the evidence had disappeared. Perhaps he convinced himself that no one would ever connect him to a child murdered in Newport Beach so many years earlier. But evidence has remarkable patience. It does not become less truthful with age. It waits, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations. Then, when science finally catches up, it tells the story exactly as it happened. Investigators now possessed what generations before them had lacked. Not suspicion, not theory, not speculation. Evidence. The kind of evidence capable of speaking in court. The kind of evidence capable of surviving cross-examination. The kind of evidence that could finally give Linda O'Keefe a voice after 50 years of silence. Across Orange County, very few people knew what was unfolding behind the scenes. The case that had haunted newspapers for decades was approaching its most dramatic moment. The frozen file was no longer merely reopened. It was leading detectives directly toward the man they believed had escaped justice for half a century. The arrest warrant was coming. And with it, one of the longest chapters in California cold case history was about to enter its final, most consequential act. The decision to move forward came after years of painstaking work, thousands of investigative hours, and countless reviews of evidence that had survived longer than anyone could have imagined. Detectives understood that this was more than another arrest. It was the culmination of a promise made in 1973, a promise that Linda O'Keefe would never be forgotten, no matter how much time passed. The arrest warrant was approved. For the investigators who had devoted years to the case, the moment carried a quiet sense of relief rather than celebration. They knew an arrest would not bring Linda back. It would not erase decades of grief endured by her family. It would not restore the childhood that had been stolen or undo the fear that had spread through an entire community. But it would do something equally important. It would finally identify the man they believed had taken her life. The operation was carefully planned. Every officer involved understood the historical significance of what they were about to do. This was not simply the arrest of an elderly suspect. It was the conclusion of one of Orange County's longest-running homicide investigations. When detectives approached the suspect, there was no dramatic chase, no desperate escape, no violent confrontation. Time had changed everything. The man who had once been young enough to overpower a 12-year-old girl was now an old man, carrying more than 5 decades of history behind him. For years, investigators believed he had lived an ordinary life while one extraordinary secret remained hidden beneath the surface. Now that secret had caught up with him. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Residents who remembered the original case struggled to believe that a mystery stretching back to the early 1970s had finally reached this point. Younger generations, many of whom had never heard Linda's name before the renewed investigation, suddenly found themselves reading about a crime committed long before they were born. The headlines carried the same astonishing message. A 50-year-old child murder had finally produced an arrest. For Linda's surviving family members, the announcement brought emotions that were impossible to separate. Relief, grief, disbelief, sorrow, hope. There is no guidebook explaining how a family should feel after waiting half a century for answers. The passage of time does not reduce loss. It simply changes its shape. Parents who lose a child never stop imagining the life that might have been. Birthdays become reminders. Holidays become reminders. Every passing year becomes another measure of everything that was taken away. Now, after decades of uncertainty, they finally had a name. The legal process began almost immediately. Prosecutors assembled the evidence that had transformed the investigation from an unsolved mystery into a criminal case supported by modern forensic science. DNA formed the foundation, but it was not presented in isolation. Investigators had reconstructed timelines, reviewed historical records, confirmed witness accounts where possible, documented every step of the forensic analysis. The prosecution understood that jurors would need to travel back in time. They would be asked to evaluate a crime committed before many of them were born. Every detail mattered. Every document mattered. Every scientific procedure mattered. Cold case prosecutions demand extraordinary precision because memories fade, but physical evidence does not. The defense faced its own difficult reality. Half a century had passed since the crime. Witnesses had died. Memories had weakened. Records had aged. The challenge was obvious. Could a trial held decades later still provide justice? The prosecution believed it could. Science had preserved what memory could not. DNA did not rely on recollection. It did not become uncertain. It did not confuse dates or faces. It remained exactly what it had been in 1973. A biological signature connecting one individual to one crime. As news organizations revisited Linda O'Keefe's story, photographs from the original investigation returned to public view. Images that had faded into newspaper archives suddenly appeared once again. A smiling 12-year-old. School photographs. Pictures from happier days. For many readers, those images made the case deeply personal. Linda stopped being a name from an old police report. She became a child whose future had been stolen. Communities across California reflected on how many other cold cases might still be waiting for similar breakthroughs. Investigators from different jurisdictions watched the case closely. It represented more than one successful arrest. It demonstrated what persistence, evidence preservation, and advances in forensic science could accomplish when combined. The investigation also carried another powerful message. Time favors neither innocence nor guilt. It simply waits. For decades, the suspect had lived without public accountability. Whether he believed he had escaped justice forever remains unknown. What became undeniable, however, was that scientific progress had erased the advantage once provided by time. The evidence collected in 1973 had become more valuable with each passing decade. That paradox fascinated investigators. The older the case became, the stronger certain forms of evidence actually grew. Technology improved. Laboratory techniques evolved. Methods became more precise. The crime itself never changed. Only humanity's ability to understand it improved. Linda's case became one of the clearest examples of that transformation. Detectives who had inherited the investigation from earlier generations often spoke about the responsibility they felt. Cold case investigators rarely receive immediate rewards. Their work unfolds over years, sometimes decades. Many begin investigations knowing they may never personally witness the outcome. Yet they continue, because every victim deserves someone willing to keep asking questions. Linda O'Keefe had become that enduring question. One generation of detectives handed the file to another. Retirements came. Careers ended. New investigators arrived. The evidence remained. Waiting. Patiently. Silently. Until science finally allowed it to tell its story. As court proceedings moved forward, the public followed each development with remarkable attention. People who had once assumed the mystery would remain unsolved watched as details hidden for decades entered the courtroom. Every hearing reminded observers of the extraordinary journey from a quiet summer afternoon in 1973 to a modern courtroom shaped by forensic technology that did not even exist when Linda was alive. The distance between those two moments measured more than 50 years. It measured the persistence of justice itself. The case had begun with a frightened community searching for a missing child. Now it stood as one of the most significant cold case breakthroughs in California history. Yet even with an arrest, one painful truth remained unchanged. Justice delayed can never become justice complete. No verdict could restore the years Linda never lived. No sentence could replace birthdays that never came, dreams never realized, or a family forever altered by a single act of violence. The legal system could identify the person responsible. It could hold him accountable. But it could never return what had been taken on that July afternoon. That absence would remain permanent. And as the courtroom prepared for the next chapter, everyone connected to the case understood that they were witnessing something extraordinarily rare, a crime that had waited more than half a century before finally confronting the man investigators believed had carried its secret for the rest of his life. As the prosecution moved forward, the courtroom became the place where two different eras collided. One belonged to the summer of 1973, when a 12-year-old girl left school expecting nothing more than the short walk home. The other belonged to the modern age, where forensic science could uncover truths that investigators half a century earlier could never have imagined. Between those two moments stretched more than 50 years of silence. For the prosecution, the challenge was unlike that of an ordinary murder trial. This was not simply about presenting evidence. It was about reconstructing history with extraordinary precision. Every document had to withstand scrutiny. Every forensic procedure had to be explained. Every conclusion had to be supported by facts that remained reliable despite the passage of decades. The DNA evidence became the cornerstone of the case. Experts explained how biological material collected in 1973 had been preserved, how modern laboratories developed a genetic profile, and how that profile was ultimately connected to the suspect through advanced investigative techniques. To many observers inside the courtroom, the science seemed almost unbelievable. The evidence had remained silent for decades. Then, through technology unavailable at the time of the murder, it spoke with remarkable clarity. The investigation itself also became part of the story. Jurors learned how generations of detectives had inherited the file, how investigators refused to discard the case despite years without meaningful progress, how every advancement in forensic science prompted another review of the evidence. The persistence of law enforcement became impossible to ignore. This was not a case solved through luck. It was solved through patience, through preservation, through thousands of hours of work carried out by people who believed that even the oldest murders deserved answers. Outside the courtroom, public interest continued to grow. News organizations revisited the original investigation. Television stations aired archival photographs of Linda. Communities across California remembered where they had been when the case first captured headlines. Some people had been children themselves in 1973. Now they watched the proceedings as grandparents. The extraordinary passage of time made every development feel historic. For Linda's family, however, history was deeply personal. Each hearing forced them to relive the worst day of their lives. Photographs that once belonged in family albums now appeared as courtroom exhibits. The little girl they remembered through birthday parties and school events had become evidence in a murder prosecution. It was a painful transformation, yet it was also necessary. Justice often requires victims to become part of a public record. The legal system must examine tragedy in painstaking detail. Every fact, every photograph, every report, every scientific finding. Only then can the truth withstand the demands of a criminal courtroom. As testimony continued, investigators described the enormous effort required to identify the suspect. The jury heard how genetic genealogy transformed what once appeared impossible into a solvable investigation. Family trees stretching across generations. Historical records examined one by one. DNA comparisons narrowing thousands of possibilities into a single identity. The process resembled detective work from another era combined with cutting-edge science. Traditional investigation had never disappeared. It had simply evolved. Every breakthrough depended upon both technology and human determination. The courtroom also served as a reminder of how dramatically criminal investigations have changed since the early 1970s. When Linda was murdered, detectives relied primarily on eyewitnesses, physical observations, and conventional forensic techniques. Today, investigators can identify unknown suspects through microscopic traces invisible to the naked eye. The contrast was striking. If those scientific tools had existed in 1973, the case might have been solved within weeks. Instead, justice waited more than half a century. Throughout the proceedings, one truth remained constant. Linda O'Keefe had no opportunity to tell her own story. The evidence told it for her. The preserved forensic material, the investigative reports, the witness statements, the reconstructed timeline. Together, they became the voice that had been silent since July 1973. For many watching the trial, that realization carried enormous emotional weight. Technology had not merely solved a crime. It had restored a voice to a child who lost hers decades earlier. The prosecution emphasized another important point. Cold cases are often misunderstood. People imagine abandoned files collecting dust inside forgotten storage rooms. The reality is very different. Many cold cases remain active. Investigators revisit them whenever new methods become available. Evidence is re-examined. Witnesses are contacted again. Laboratories apply increasingly sophisticated techniques. Justice may be delayed. It is not necessarily abandoned. Linda's case became one of the strongest examples of that philosophy. Across the country, detectives working other unsolved murders follow the proceedings closely. They recognize something larger than a single conviction. The investigation demonstrated what careful evidence preservation could accomplish. It reinforced the importance of refusing to discard difficult cases simply because time has passed. Somewhere, in police evidence rooms across America, thousands of unresolved investigations still waited. Some contained fingerprints. Others contained DNA. Others held evidence that future scientific discoveries may one day unlock. Linda's case offered hope to countless other families still waiting for answers. Not certainty. Hope. As the legal process continued, the suspect faced allegations connected to a crime committed more than 50 years earlier. The contrast was impossible to ignore. An elderly defendant stood accused of murdering a 12-year-old girl whose life had ended before many people in the courtroom had even been born. Time had changed appearances. It had changed technology. It had changed the world itself. But it had not changed the facts preserved inside the evidence. For investigators who had spent years rebuilding the case, that was perhaps the greatest lesson of all. Human memory weakens. Paper fades. Buildings disappear. Neighborhoods change. But properly preserved forensic evidence can outlive generations. It waits without emotion, without urgency, without forgetting, waiting for the day someone finally learns how to understand what it has been saying all along. As each day of testimony passed, Linda's name once again echoed through court records, news reports, and public discussion. Not as an unsolved mystery, not as a forgotten child, but as the center of one of the most remarkable cold case investigations in modern California history. The courtroom had become more than a place to determine guilt. It had become the final chapter in a promise first made more than 5 decades earlier. A promise that one little girl would never simply become another forgotten photograph in a dusty file. A promise that, no matter how many years passed, someone would keep searching. Someone would keep asking questions. Someone would refuse to let silence become the final answer. As the case drew closer to its conclusion, the attention surrounding Linda O'Keefe's murder reached far beyond Orange County. What had once been a local tragedy had become a national example of how modern forensic science could reach back through history and confront crimes once believed to be permanently unsolved. Investigators, prosecutors, forensic scientists, and families connected to other cold cases followed every development with intense interest. For many, Linda's case represented something larger than a single prosecution. It represented possibility. For decades, countless families had lived with unanswered questions remarkably similar to those that haunted the O'Keefe family. Who was responsible? Why had no one been arrested? Would the truth ever be known? Those questions echoed across thousands of unsolved homicide investigations throughout the United States. Linda's story suggested that time alone was no longer enough to protect those who had escaped justice. Advances in forensic science had fundamentally changed the equation. Evidence collected decades earlier was becoming increasingly valuable rather than less. Every improvement in laboratory technology gave investigators another opportunity to revisit cases that once appeared hopeless. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors continued assembling a timeline that bridged half a century. Every witness, every scientific expert, every investigative report added another layer to a narrative that had remained incomplete since July 1973. The jury was asked to examine not only the crime itself, but the extraordinary journey required to identify the person accused of committing it. It was a journey marked by persistence rather than speed. Nothing about the investigation had been simple. Nothing had come easily. The evidence had survived. The investigators had persevered. Science had evolved. Only then did the pieces finally begin fitting together. Members of the public often imagine cold case investigations ending with one dramatic discovery. The reality is far more complex. Breakthroughs usually arrive after years of patient work. One document confirms another. One laboratory result supports an investigative theory. One historical record narrows a timeline. The truth emerges gradually, built from hundreds of individual decisions made by detectives who refused to abandon the search. Linda's case followed exactly that pattern. There was no single miracle. There was no sudden confession. There was only evidence. Evidence carefully collected in 1973. Evidence carefully preserved for decades. Evidence finally understood through modern science. As journalists revisited the original murder, they also explored the lasting impact it had left on Newport Beach. Residents who had grown up during the 1970s remembered the fear that spread after Linda disappeared. Parents had changed routines. Children were warned not to walk alone. Communities that once felt untouched by violent crime suddenly recognized that danger could exist anywhere. The murder altered daily life long after newspaper headlines faded. Even decades later, longtime residents could still recall where they were when they first heard Linda's name. Some remembered helping search. Others remembered seeing missing person flyers. Many remembered the overwhelming disbelief that such a crime could happen in broad daylight. Those memories never completely disappeared. They simply waited beneath the surface until the renewed investigation brought them back into public conversation. For younger generations, the case carried a different lesson. Many had grown up in a world where DNA evidence was already a familiar concept. They understood forensic science through television, documentaries, and modern criminal investigations. Linda's case revealed how revolutionary those scientific advances truly were. In 1973, investigators could only preserve evidence and hope. Today, that same evidence could identify a suspect with extraordinary precision. The difference between those two realities measured 50 years of scientific progress. The case also highlighted another uncomfortable truth. Some crimes remain unsolved not because investigators failed. They remain unsolved because technology has not yet reached the point where answers are possible. Linda's investigation demonstrated why preserving evidence is so important. No detective in 1973 could predict what laboratories would be capable of half a century later. Yet because the evidence remained intact, future investigators inherited opportunities their predecessors never had. That lesson spread quickly through the law enforcement community. Cold case units across the country increased efforts to re-examine historical evidence. Cases once considered impossible returned to forensic laboratories. Investigators searched storage rooms for forgotten biological samples. Evidence collected generations earlier suddenly became valuable again. Linda O'Keefe's murder had become part of a much larger transformation in criminal justice. The message was unmistakable. The past was no longer beyond reach. Meanwhile, for Linda's family, public attention remained secondary to something far more personal. Justice could never restore what had been lost. The passing of decades had not softened the absence. Family photographs still ended with a 12-year-old girl. Future memories had never been created. Every milestone became a reminder of the life that should have continued. No courtroom could change that. No verdict could rewrite history. Yet knowing the identity of the person responsible answered a question that had haunted every year since 1973. Uncertainty finally gave way to truth. Even painful truth can provide a measure of peace that endless uncertainty never can. Investigators often describe this moment as one of the most meaningful aspects of cold case work. Families may never experience happiness, but they can finally experience certainty. The endless wondering ends. The endless imagining ends. The search itself comes to an end. As proceedings continued, prosecutors emphasized that justice delayed remained justice pursued. The extraordinary passage of time did not diminish the seriousness of the crime. If anything, it reinforced society's commitment to holding offenders accountable regardless of how many years had passed. That principle resonated far beyond a single courtroom. It reminded the public that murder investigations are unique. They carry no expiration date. Evidence may wait. Investigators may change. Technology may evolve. But the obligation to seek the truth remains constant. Linda O'Keefe's name had survived 50 years because investigators refused to surrender that obligation. The frozen file had endured countless office moves, personnel changes, and technological revolutions. Now it stood as proof that persistence can outlast silence. What began as one of California's most heartbreaking, unsolved child murders had become one of its most remarkable cold case investigations. Yet the emotional weight of the story remained exactly where it had always been. Not inside laboratory reports. Not inside legal documents. Not inside courtroom testimony. It remained with the image of a 12-year-old girl walking home beneath the California sun, unaware that her ordinary afternoon would become a mystery lasting more than half a century. Everything that followed, the decades of investigation, the scientific breakthroughs, the relentless pursuit of answers, began with that single ordinary walk. A walk that should have ended at home. Instead, it changed the lives of everyone who would spend the next 50 years refusing to let Linda O'Keefe be forgotten. More than 5 decades had passed since Linda O'Keefe left her summer school class and began the short walk home. During those years, the world had changed in almost every imaginable way. Technology transformed communication, transportation, and criminal investigations. Entire generations grew up without knowing the details of her case, while those who remembered 1973 continued to wonder whether the mystery would ever be resolved. For law enforcement, the investigation became an enduring reminder that preserving evidence is one of the most important responsibilities in any homicide case. Detectives who originally worked the investigation could not have anticipated the scientific advances that would emerge decades later. Yet their careful documentation and preservation of physical evidence allowed future investigators to examine the case using tools that simply did not exist at the time of the crime. The renewed investigation also demonstrated how modern forensic science depends on collaboration. Detectives, forensic scientists, laboratory analysts, genealogists, prosecutors, and evidence technicians each played a role in moving the case forward. No single breakthrough solved the investigation on its own. Instead, the outcome resulted from years of coordinated work, with each development building upon the one before it. For Linda's family, the renewed attention brought both hope and painful memories. Every public announcement, every court filing, and every news report returned them to the events of July 1973. Although time had passed, the loss remained part of their daily lives. The opportunity to see the case move forward did not erase decades of grief, but it represented a commitment that Linda's death would not be forgotten. The case also prompted broader discussions throughout the criminal justice community. Investigators revisited other unsolved homicides, asking whether preserved evidence might now yield answers through advances in DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy. Agencies that had once considered certain cases unsolvable began reviewing archived evidence with renewed optimism. Equally important, the investigation illustrated the value of long-term institutional memory. Cold case units often inherit files created by detectives who retired years earlier. Every report, photograph, evidence log, and witness interview becomes part of a historical record that future investigators rely upon. The work of one generation often creates the opportunity for the next to succeed. As the legal process continued, the focus remained on presenting reliable evidence and ensuring that the proceedings reflected the standards required by the justice system. High-profile cases naturally attract public attention, but courtroom decisions depend on evidence introduced under the rules of law rather than public opinion. That distinction is especially important in cases spanning many decades, where accuracy and procedural fairness remain essential. Linda O'Keefe's case ultimately became known not only because of the length of time it remained unsolved, but because it demonstrated how scientific progress can reshape criminal investigations. Evidence collected in one era may acquire entirely new significance in another. What once appeared inconclusive may later become central to identifying a suspect. For families still waiting for answers in other cold cases, the investigation offered a measure of hope. It did not suggest that every unsolved case will reach the same outcome, but it showed that unanswered questions do not necessarily remain unanswered forever. As forensic methods continue to evolve, investigators may find new opportunities to examine evidence that has remained dormant for years. More than 50 years separated the crime from the renewed investigation, yet the central purpose never changed. Detectives sought to determine what happened, identify the person responsible, and present the evidence through the legal process. That objective remained constant despite changing technology, changing personnel, and changing generations. Linda's story continues to be remembered because it reflects both the tragedy of a young life cut short and the determination of investigators and family members who never allowed the case to disappear completely. It stands as an example of how persistence, careful evidence preservation, and scientific advancement can converge many years after a crime occurred, ensuring that even the oldest investigations continue to receive careful attention. Ality that future science may answer questions that current technology cannot. Linda O'Keefe's case illustrated that principle with unusual clarity. The investigation also highlighted the value of cooperation among multiple disciplines. Detectives worked alongside forensic scientists, prosecutors, laboratory specialists, and investigative genealogists. Each contributed expertise that, on its own, would not have been sufficient. Together, however, those efforts allowed investigators to revisit evidence collected in 1973 and evaluate it using methods developed many years later. For communities across the United States, the case renewed public interest in unsolved homicides involving children. It prompted discussions about the thousands of cold cases that remain open and the ongoing work of specialized investigative units dedicated to reviewing historical evidence. Although many investigations may never reach a definitive conclusion, the continued development of forensic science offers opportunities that were unavailable to previous generations of investigators. The case also underscored an important distinction between public attention and the justice process. While media coverage can raise awareness and encourage witnesses to come forward, courtroom decisions depend on admissible evidence, scientific analysis, and legal standards. Maintaining that distinction helps ensure that cases are resolved through objective evaluation rather than public sentiment. For Linda's family, the years following the renewed investigation represented a different chapter in a journey that had begun more than half a century earlier. Although no legal proceeding could restore what had been lost, the continued pursuit of the case reflected an enduring commitment to accountability. Families affected by violent crime often describe the search for answers as lasting long after headlines fade, and Linda's case was no exception. The broader significance of the investigation lies not only in its outcome, but also in the lessons it offers. It demonstrates the importance of careful evidence preservation, comprehensive documentation, and sustained institutional commitment. It also shows how advances in science can fundamentally change the possibilities available to investigators reviewing historical cases. Today, Linda O'Keefe's name remains associated with one of California's most notable cold case investigations. Her story continues to be referenced in discussions of forensic innovation, investigative persistence, and the evolution of homicide investigations over the past several decades. As laboratories continue developing more sensitive analytical techniques and investigators gain access to new forensic tools, other long unsolved cases may also benefit from renewed examination. The history of criminal investigation suggests that evidence, once considered inconclusive, may become increasingly informative as scientific capabilities advance. Ultimately, Linda O'Keefe's case serves as a reminder that the pursuit of justice does not end when an investigation becomes a cold case. Instead, it enters a different phase, one defined by patience, preservation, and the willingness to revisit old evidence with new methods. That commitment remains one of the defining characteristics of modern cold case investigations and continues to shape efforts to resolve unsolved homicides across the country. More than half a century after Linda O'Keefe lost her life, her case continues to be remembered as both a tragedy and a milestone in the evolution of cold case investigations. While the passage of time changed nearly every aspect of the world around it, the commitment to seeking answers never disappeared. The investigation demonstrated that justice can depend on decisions made long before the necessary technology exists. The careful preservation of evidence in 1973 allowed later generations of investigators to apply scientific methods that were unimaginable at the time of the crime. Without that preservation, the opportunity to revisit the case would have been significantly diminished. Linda's case also reflects the dedication of the many professionals who contributed to the investigation across different decades. Detectives, forensic scientists, evidence technicians, prosecutors, laboratory analysts, and investigative genealogists each inherited part of the responsibility. Many of those individuals never met one another, yet their work formed a continuous chain of efforts spanning generations. For Linda's family, no investigation could restore the years that were lost. A child whose future ended at the age of 12 could never reclaim the experiences, milestones, and opportunities that should have followed. That reality remains at the heart of the case and serves as a reminder that every homicide investigation concerns a person, a family, and a community, not simply evidence or legal proceedings. The broader impact of the case reaches beyond Orange County. Across the United States and in many other countries, law enforcement agencies continue to review unsolved homicides using increasingly sophisticated forensic techniques. Improvements in DNA analysis, digital record systems, and investigative genealogy have transformed what is possible, allowing investigators to revisit evidence collected decades earlier with renewed confidence. Even so, technology alone cannot solve every case. Successful investigations continue to depend on careful evidence handling, accurate documentation, collaboration among specialists, and a sustained commitment to following the facts wherever they lead. Scientific advances provide powerful tools, but those tools are effective only when supported by thorough investigative work. Linda O'Keefe's story remains an important example of why cold cases should not be viewed as forgotten cases. Many remain active, with investigators continuing to evaluate evidence as new methods become available. Although not every investigation will achieve the same outcome, each preserved file represents the possibility that future developments may provide answers that were once beyond reach. For families still waiting for progress in other unsolved cases, the investigation offers a reminder that the search for truth can continue long after public attention has faded. Advances in forensic science have changed the landscape of criminal investigation, creating opportunities that previous generations could not have anticipated. Ultimately, the lasting legacy of Linda O'Keefe's case is not defined solely by the length of time involved or by the scientific techniques employed. It is defined by an enduring commitment to accountability, the careful pursuit of evidence, and the principle that every victim deserves to be remembered with dignity. More than 50 years after a 12-year-old girl failed to return home, her name continues to stand as a reminder that justice is often a long process rather than a single moment. The case underscores the importance of preserving evidence, supporting scientific innovation, and maintaining the determination to seek the truth, regardless of how much time has passed. Linda O'Keefe's story remains part of the history of modern criminal investigation, not because it was unsolved for so long, but because it demonstrated how persistence, careful forensic work, and advances in science can illuminate even the oldest cases. Above all, it reminds us that behind every cold case is a human life, and that the pursuit of justice begins with ensuring that person is never forgotten. On a warm afternoon in July 1973, a 12-year-old girl named Linda O'Keefe left a summer school program in Newport Beach, California. It was an ordinary day, the kind of day that rarely becomes part of history. The streets were familiar. The neighborhood was peaceful. The distance between school and home was short. Like many children of that era, Linda knew the route well. She was simply making her way back to her family. But Linda never arrived home. Within hours, a routine summer afternoon became the beginning of one of California's longest-running unsolved homicide investigations. For her family, the questions began immediately. Where was Linda? What happened to her? And who was responsible? Those questions would remain unanswered for decades. The investigation that followed would span generations, involve changing technologies, and eventually demonstrate how modern forensic science could transform cases once considered impossible to solve. But before the science, before the breakthroughs, there was a family searching for a child. Linda O'Keefe was remembered by those who knew her as a bright and caring young girl. She was 12 years old, with a personality that left an impression on the people around her. Like many children her age, she was discovering the world, building friendships, and imagining the future ahead of her. That future disappeared in a single day. When Linda failed to return home, concern quickly turned into fear. Her family and community began searching for answers. Neighbors joined efforts to locate her. Authorities were notified. Investigators began piecing together the events surrounding her disappearance. The search revealed a devastating reality. Linda had been murdered. The news shocked Newport Beach. At the time, the community was widely viewed as a peaceful coastal area. The idea that a child could be taken from such an environment created fear and disbelief. Families who once felt secure began questioning how something so tragic could happen in their own neighborhood. Investigators immediately began examining the circumstances surrounding Linda's final hours. They interviewed witnesses. They reviewed the timeline. They searched for any detail that could explain what had happened. But the case presented enormous challenges. There was no immediate suspect. No clear motive. No simple explanation. The person responsible had left investigators with questions instead of answers. One of the details that remained part of the investigation involved reports of a suspicious vehicle in the area. Like many early investigative leads, it represented both possibility and uncertainty. It suggested that someone may have noticed something unusual, but it did not immediately reveal who was responsible. The investigation continued. Detectives followed leads. Evidence was collected. Statements were recorded. But time began working against them. In 1973, forensic technology was limited compared with modern standards. DNA analysis was not yet available as a routine investigative tool. Biological evidence could be preserved, but investigators did not yet have the ability to extract the information hidden within it. What appeared to be a dead end was, in reality, a question waiting for future science. The case remained open. The years passed. New detectives eventually inherited the file from those who had first worked the investigation. They studied the reports, examined the evidence, and confronted the same challenge faced by previous investigators. How do you solve a crime committed decades earlier? A cold case is not simply an old case. It is an unfinished case. Behind every file number is a person whose life ended and a family still waiting for answers. Linda's name remained connected to that unfinished search. Her case became part of a larger conversation about the importance of preserving evidence and continuing to investigate crimes even when immediate answers are unavailable. Because evidence has a unique quality. It can wait. A witness's memory may fade. A suspect's appearance may change. A neighborhood may transform. But properly preserved evidence can survive beyond generations. And as science continued to advance, investigators began to reconsider what was possible. Technologies that did not exist in 1973 began changing the landscape of criminal investigation. Cases that had remained unresolved for decades were being reopened. Evidence collected long ago was being examined through new methods. For families who had spent years without answers, these developments offered something that had become increasingly rare. Hope. The possibility that time had not erased the truth, only delayed its discovery. Linda O'Keefe's case would eventually become one of those investigations where the past and present collided. A case that began with a child's disappearance. A case that remained unresolved through decades of change. A case that would challenge investigators to combine traditional detective work with the most advanced tools available. For more than 50 years, the answer remained hidden. But the evidence was still there, waiting for the moment when science could finally understand what it had been holding all along. After the initial shock of Linda O'Keefe's death, investigators faced the difficult task of reconstructing a crime with very few immediate answers. The first hours and days after a homicide are often considered the most important. Detectives search for witnesses, preserve evidence, and attempt to understand the sequence of events before memories fade and opportunities disappear. In Linda's case, investigators worked to build a timeline of her final moments. She had left a summer school program and was making her way home through a familiar area of Newport Beach. There was nothing unusual about the beginning of that journey. It was a routine part of a normal summer day. That was what made the crime so difficult to understand. A child had disappeared during an ordinary moment. There was no obvious warning, no clear explanation. Only the devastating realization that something terrible had occurred. Investigators began speaking with people who may have seen Linda that afternoon. They searched for anyone who noticed unusual activity in the area, any vehicle that seemed out of place, or any detail that might provide a connection to the person responsible. In a case with limited information, every observation mattered. A passing vehicle, a person walking nearby, a brief encounter that seemed insignificant at the time. Investigators understood that small details could eventually become important pieces of a much larger picture. One reported detail involved a white vent seen in the area around the time Linda disappeared. At the beginning of the investigation, it represented a possible lead among many others. Detectives considered whether the vehicle might have been connected to the crime, but the information available at the time was not enough to identify a specific person. The investigation continued without a definitive answer. As weeks became months, the urgency remained, but the path forward became increasingly difficult. The detectives working the case were operating in a different era of criminal investigation. Modern forensic techniques that are now considered standard did not exist in 1973. There were no comprehensive DNA databases, no advanced genetic genealogy tools, no ability to compare unknown biological evidence against millions of potential relatives. Investigators relied on the methods available to them: interviews, physical evidence, traditional forensic analysis, the experience and judgment of detectives. Those methods solve many crimes, but some cases remain beyond reach. Linda's investigation became one of those cases. For her family, however, the passage of time did not reduce the importance of finding answers. A homicide investigation may become less visible to the public over the years, but for families of victims, the absence of answers continues every day. Important dates become reminders. Memories become more painful because they contain questions that cannot be answered. The search for justice becomes part of everyday life. As years passed, Linda's case moved into the category known as a cold case. The term can sometimes be misunderstood. A cold case does not mean that investigators stop caring. It means that the case has reached a point where available leads have been exhausted, while the possibility of future progress remains. Many cold cases remain active for decades. Files are preserved. Evidence is stored. New information is added when it becomes available. Investigators know that circumstances can change. A witness may come forward. A new technology may emerge. A connection may appear where none existed before. For Linda's case, that future possibility depended heavily on the evidence collected during the original investigation. The importance of evidence preservation cannot be overstated. When detectives collect physical evidence, they are not only working for the present investigation, they are also preserving opportunities for future generations of investigators. The officers who handled Linda's case in 1973 could not have known what forensic science would become decades later. They could not have predicted the development of technologies capable of analyzing microscopic biological material. But they preserved what they could, and that decision would eventually become one of the most important factors in the investigation's future. As the decades passed, criminal investigations around the world began changing. DNA analysis transformed forensic science. Cases that had remained unsolved for 20, 30, or 40 years began receiving renewed attention. Investigators started looking at old evidence differently. A sample that once seemed meaningless could now contain valuable information. A forgotten file could become an active investigation again. The concept of a cold case began to change. The past was no longer completely unreachable. Science was creating new possibilities. And eventually, Linda O'Keefe's case would enter this new era. But before that breakthrough could happen, the investigation would need patience. It would require detectives willing to revisit old information. Scientists willing to examine evidence collected decades earlier. And a system capable of connecting modern technology with a crime that belonged to another generation. For more than 40 years, Linda's case remained unresolved. Her name remained attached to a question that had never been answered. But the investigation was not finished. The evidence remained. The records remained. The search continued. And slowly, the tools needed to unlock the truth were beginning to emerge. For decades, Linda O'Keefe's case remained a reminder of the limitations of time and technology in criminal investigations. The investigators who first handled the case had worked with the tools available in the early 1970s. They collected evidence, interviewed witnesses, and documented every detail they believed could help identify the person responsible. But some questions remained beyond their reach. The evidence existed. The answers did not. As the years passed, the investigation became part of a growing number of cold cases across the United States. These were cases that had not been forgotten, but had reached a point where traditional investigative methods could no longer provide a clear path forward. For detectives who later inherited Linda's file, the challenge was not only finding new information. It was learning how to look at old information in a new way. Cold case investigations often require a different approach from active investigations. The urgency of the first days and weeks is replaced by careful review. Investigators must examine previous conclusions, reconsider old assumptions, and ask whether advances in science have created opportunities that did not previously exist. Linda's case represented exactly that challenge. A new generation of investigators began reviewing the available evidence with modern knowledge. They studied the original reports and examined the materials collected decades earlier. They looked for details that earlier investigators could not have fully understood because the technology simply was not available. The world of forensic science had changed dramatically. One of the most significant developments was the advancement of DNA analysis. When Linda was murdered in 1973, DNA profiling was not part of criminal investigations. Scientists understood genetics, but the ability to create a detailed genetic profile from biological evidence would not become widely available until years later. By the time modern DNA techniques became established, investigators around the world were beginning to realize something important. Old evidence could still hold new information. A sample collected decades earlier could potentially identify a person who had never been connected to the crime. This changed the way law enforcement viewed cold cases. The question was no longer only, what evidence do we have? It became, what can today's science reveal from the evidence we already preserved? That shift created new opportunities. Across the country, investigators reopened cases that had remained unresolved for decades. Some involved murders from the 1970s and 1980s. Others were even older. In many of these investigations, breakthroughs came not from finding new witnesses, but from re-examining evidence that had been waiting for scientific advancement. Linda's case entered this new era of investigation. The process required patience and careful analysis. Cold case work rarely follows a straight path. There are periods of progress followed by long periods of uncertainty. Investigators may spend months reviewing records before discovering one meaningful connection. The work is often invisible to the public. There are no dramatic announcements during every step. No guarantee that a promising lead will succeed. Only the continued effort to find answers. For Linda's family, those years represented a complicated balance between hope and disappointment. Every possible breakthrough carried the possibility of finally learning the truth. But previous decades had taught them that progress could be uncertain. They had lived through years when the case received attention, only to return to silence. They had waited while technology changed. They had waited while investigators changed. They had waited while the world moved forward. Yet Linda's memory remained. The importance of that persistence became clear as investigators began exploring new forensic approaches. One of those approaches was investigative genetic genealogy. This method represented a major transformation in criminal investigations. Instead of searching only for a direct DNA match in traditional law enforcement databases, investigators could use genetic relationships to identify possible family connections. The process was complex. It required combining DNA science with traditional genealogy research. Investigators and specialists could analyze genetic relationships, build family trees, and gradually narrow possible connections through historical records. Birth certificates, marriage records, public archives, family histories. Each piece of information helped create a clearer picture. It was not a simple search. It was a reconstruction of identity through generations. For cold cases, this approach opened possibilities that once seemed impossible. A suspect who had never entered the criminal justice system could potentially be identified through relatives who had voluntarily shared genetic information. The past could now be connected to the present in ways investigators of earlier generations could never have imagined. For Linda's case, this represented a significant turning point. The investigation was no longer limited by the technology of 1973. It had entered a new era. But scientific tools alone were not enough. Investigators still needed careful reasoning. They needed to verify every connection. They needed to ensure that any conclusion was supported by evidence. The responsibility was enormous. After decades of uncertainty, the goal was not simply to find a person. The goal was to find the right person. That distinction defined the next phase of the investigation. The case that had remained silent for so long was beginning to produce new information. The evidence collected decades earlier was being examined through a modern lens. A file once considered nearly impossible to solve was becoming active again. The investigation was moving from questions toward possibilities. And for the first time in many years, there was a reason to believe that the mystery surrounding Linda O'Keefe's death might finally be answered. The return of attention to Linda O'Keefe's case did not happen because of one single discovery. It was the result of years of progress in forensic science, combined with the determination of investigators who believed that old cases still deserved new attention. Cold case investigations are often built on patience. Unlike a recent crime, where witnesses may still remember details clearly and evidence can be immediately analyzed, decades-old investigations require a different kind of work. Detectives must revisit information collected by previous generations. They must understand the technology available at the time, recognize its limitations, and consider what modern science might now reveal. For Linda's case, the evidence collected in 1973 became the foundation of the renewed investigation. The investigators who originally handled the case could not have known how valuable that evidence would become. They were working to solve a crime using the methods of their time. They collected and preserved materials because that was standard investigative practice. Decades later, those decisions created an opportunity. Modern forensic laboratories had developed methods capable of examining biological evidence with a level of detail that earlier investigators could never have achieved. The science had changed. The evidence had remained. That combination created the possibility of answers. As investigators examined the case again, they approached it with caution. A cold case cannot be solved simply by finding something new. Every piece of information must be carefully evaluated. A theory must be tested. A potential suspect must be connected through reliable evidence, not assumption. The renewed investigation involved multiple areas of expertise. Detectives reviewed historical records and investigative reports. Forensic specialists examined available evidence. Genealogists analyzed possible genetic connections. Prosecutors considered how evidence developed decades after a crime could be presented within the legal system. Each part of the process required accuracy. The goal was not just to reopen a mystery. The goal was to establish the truth. One of the most significant changes in modern investigations has been the relationship between DNA science and genealogy research. Traditional DNA searches often depend on finding a direct match in law enforcement databases. But many individuals connected to older crimes have never been arrested, meaning their DNA may not exist in those systems. Investigative genetic genealogy created another path. Instead of asking, "Whose DNA is this?" investigators could begin by asking, "Who might this person be related to?" That question opened a completely different investigative process. Genetic information could reveal distant family relationships. Those relationships could lead researchers through generations of family history. Names could be identified, examined, and compared with known facts from the investigation. But the process required extreme care. A genetic connection does not immediately identify a suspect. It creates possibilities. Those possibilities must then be investigated through traditional detective work. Age, location, personal history, timeline, opportunity. Every detail must align. In Linda's case, investigators worked to separate possibilities from facts. They examined whether potential individuals could realistically have been connected to the crime. They reviewed available records and looked for consistency between historical information and the evidence. This combination of science and traditional investigation became the key. Technology provided new direction. Detective work provided confirmation. The renewed investigation also reflected a broader transformation happening across law enforcement. For many years, cold cases were often viewed as investigations with limited options. Without new witnesses or obvious leads, progress could become extremely difficult. But advances in forensic science changed that perception. Evidence collected decades earlier was no longer viewed only as a historical record. It became an opportunity. Across the country, investigators began returning to old files. Cases that had remained unresolved for decades were reconsidered. Families who had waited years for answers began receiving updates they never expected. The progress did not happen overnight. Each case required time, resources, and careful decision-making. Linda's investigation followed that same pattern. Behind every public announcement were months and years of work that most people never saw. The reviewing of documents, the analysis of evidence, the verification of information, the careful preparation required before moving forward. For Linda's family, the possibility of resolution carried deep emotional meaning. A cold case creates a unique form of uncertainty. Families may know what happened in general terms, but they continue living without knowing who was responsible. They may wonder whether the person is still alive, whether they are nearby, or whether they will ever face accountability. The reopening of an investigation changes that uncertainty. It creates the possibility of an answer, but it also brings back painful memories. Every new development connects the present to the day when everything changed. For investigators, that responsibility remains central. The purpose of solving a cold case is not only identifying a suspect. It is providing answers to those who have lived without them. As the renewed examination of Linda O'Keefe's case continued, investigators moved closer to a significant development. The evidence that had remained silent for decades was beginning to reveal information. The case was no longer only a historical mystery. It had become an active investigation once again. A crime from another era was being examined with modern tools. A file that had waited more than 50 years was receiving renewed attention. And the possibility that the truth could finally emerge was becoming stronger.